Carlos Reutemann was the nearly man of Formula One in the late 70s and early 80s. He twice left teams just before their cars won the World Championship, lost out on one World Championship in the last race of the season, and finished third on 3 other occasions. Hugely popular in his native Argentina, Reutemann was destined to never win his home race, but he did win 12 Grand Prix and was one of the more thoughtful, sensitive drivers to sit in a Grand Prix car. Many claimed that Reutemann often beat himself, with emotional problems and an inability to be ruthless, especially in the face of teammates who had no such qualms. On his day, Reutemann was simply untouchable. On other days, he was beaten in his own mind before the race even began. What was the story of Carlos Reutemann? Born in Santa Fe, Argentina in 1942, Reutemann had mixed Italian and Swiss-German roots. He earned his nickname Lola at a young age, apparently because he loved animals, and called piglets Lolachones, which was shortened to become the nickname which stuck. He grew up at a time when Grand Prix racing was extremely popular in Argentina, as a result of the successes of Juan Manuel Fangio and José Froilán González, the former winning 5 World Championships in the 1950s, whilst the latter was the first driver to win a championship Grand Prix for Ferrari. At the age of 12, Reutemann began racing go-karts, and then moved into saloon cars with a Fiat 1500. He moved into the local Formula 2 Championship for 1968 and 1969, before the Automobile Club of Argentina sponsored him to move to Europe and race at Brabham in the European Formula 2 Championship alongside motorcycle racer Benedicto Caldarella. His debut at Hockenheim was notable for a collision which eliminated Jochen Rindt, one of the many Formula 1 drivers still supplementing their incomes by racing in Formula 2. Reutemann would race in Formula 2 until 1972, finishing as runner-up in the 1971 championship to Ronnie Peterson. He had been leading the championship at the halfway point in the season, until Peterson put together a run of 4 wins in 5 races to steal the title away. It was to be a running theme in Reutemann's career. In 1972, Reutemann made his Formula 1 debut for Brabham in his home race in Argentina, where he claimed pole position, one of only 4 drivers ever to achieve that feat, alongside Giuseppe Farina in the first ever World Championship Grand Prix, Mario Andretti and Jacques Villeneuve. He fought with Jackie Stewart for the lead in the early part of the race, before having to stop to replace worn-out tyres and eventually finishing in 7th. He would follow that race up with victory in the non-championship Brazilian Grand Prix at Interlagos, qualifying second behind world champion-to-be Emerson Fittipaldi, and winning the race from former Formula 2 rival Ronnie Peterson by more than half a lap. Reutemann scored his first points with 4th place at the Canadian Grand Prix in Mosport, having been involved in a race-long battle with Denny Hulme, the Kiwi frustrated by Reutemann's ability to resist his overtaking moves all afternoon long. In fact, Reutemann would have finished 3rd, but for his car running out of fuel on the last lap, allowing Hulme to pass. In 1973, Brabham introduced the new BT42, the first Grand Prix car designed by Gordon Murray, who was to become recognised as Formula One's most innovative and talented car designer. The BT42 was smaller than its contemporaries and built to be simple. Its triangular cross-section made it aerodynamically efficient. But whilst the car was built to be simple, early reliability issues prevented Reutemann from producing results. However, in Sweden, Reutemann claimed 4th place, then followed that up with 3rd place and a first podium finish in France, holding off Jackie Stewart by less than half a second. The British, Austrian and Italian Grand Prix brought more points finishes, before Reutemann claimed another podium in the final race of the season at Watkins Glen, on a weekend overshadowed by the death of François Sever. 1974 was a landmark season for Reutemann, Brabham and Gordon Murray, with their new BT44 car. Reutemann claimed victory in Murray's home race in South Africa, holding off Lauda's Ferrari until its engine died, leaving Reutemann to coast the remaining handful of laps to a popular victory. It was the first Grand Prix victory for a Gordon Murray-designed car, first victory for Brabham since coming under the ownership of Bernie Ecclestone, and a fine first win for Reutemann, who had looked the class of the field. The BT44 was fast but somewhat unreliable, and after that victory Reutemann retired from 5 of the next 6 races, before taking another dominant win in Austria. For most of the race the Brabham's mirrors had been full of chasing cars. First Lauda, then Regazzoni, and after the 2 Ferrari drivers retired, teammate Carlos Pace. Through it all, Reutemann sailed on relentlessly to claim his second win of the season. He followed that up with another victory at Watkins Glen in the season finale. Having claimed pole position, Reutemann led the race from start to finish, initially seeing off a challenge from James Hunt's Hesketh, before easing away to take an accomplished victory and 6th place in the championship, a result which could have been much better but for the early season reliability issues. However, all of this success was to come after heartbreak at the first race of the season in Argentina. Driving the BT42, as the BT44 wasn't ready, Reutemann had won an early battle with Peterson to claim the lead, causing the home crowd to lift the tops off the grandstands with their roared approval. He then ran away from the field, and was nearly half a lap to the good when, just 5 laps from the checkered flag, a distributor problem slowed the Brabham, and although Reutemann was able to maintain his lead right up to the penultimate lap, Denny Hulme passed him to lead the final lap and steal victory away. The Brabham eventually died completely half a lap from the flag. Argentina was to prove a cruel race for Reutemann throughout his career. In 1975, the revised BT44B found its missing reliability, but gave up some speed as a result. The Ferrari of Niki Lauda was the class of the field, winning the title at a canter. Reutemann battled with Fittipaldi for second spot, losing out only at the final race. The season started well, with Reutemann scoring podium finishes in 5 of the first 7 races. And he claimed victory in the German Grand Prix later in the season, with an intelligent drive in a car which was not the best. The Nürburgring Nordschleife was a challenging proposition, and in 1975, that was made more challenging by the number of stones and flints which were dragged from the trackside onto the racing line by cars running off the road. Several drivers suffered from punctures as a result, including Niki Lauda, who had been leading comfortably in his Ferrari. Reutemann, who had been driving with an eye on the rubble on the track and picking a racing line to avoid the problem areas, swept past into the lead, running the last 4 laps with even more circumspection to claim another well-judged victory. For 1976, Brabham introduced the new Alfa Romeo-powered BT45, and it was a reliability disaster, with Reutemann retiring from 9 of the first 12 races. It was the year of Niki Lauda's awful accident at the Nürburgring, and whilst the Austrian recuperated in hospital, Ferrari approached Reutemann to replace him, believing that the championship leader would not return. Reutemann negotiated a buyout from his Brabham contract and signed for Ferrari, expecting to race in the final 4 races of the season before joining the team in earnest for 1977. Lauda's miraculous comeback, just 6 weeks after being given the last rights, left Ferrari in a difficult position. It had 3 drivers signed for the Italian Grand Prix. In scenes from a Machiavelli intrigue, Ferrari tried to persuade Lauda not to return, preferring to lose the championship with an incapacitated driver, rather than fight for it with one they did not believe was able to perform anymore. Lauda enforced his contract with Ferrari and raced at Monza, with current and future teammates Regazzoni and Reutemann also entered. Lauda claimed an impressive 4th place, whilst Reutemann struggled, so Ferrari reverted to its original lineup for the remainder of the season, forcing Reutemann to watch the final 3 races from the sidelines. After Lauda had quit the Japanese Grand Prix because of the rain, many in the team were telling Enzo Ferrari that Lauda was finished. Enzo offered Lauda the team manager role for 1977, believing the advice of his team, but also wanting to ensure Lauda would not be able to drive elsewhere, in case he wasn't quite as finished as some in the team believed. When Lauda offered to tear up his Ferrari contract, freeing him to move elsewhere, Enzo caved, but informed him that Reutemann would be the team's number 1 driver for 1977. 1977 was to prove a challenging season for Reutemann. Lauda blamed him for the problems he had with Ferrari following his return from the accident in Germany. As it was, the two were well matched in the early part of the season, but far from being the number 2 driver, Lauda drove the season of his life, finishing on the podium 10 times and winning 3 races to clinch the title in Italy with 2 races to spare. Lauda did not hide his dislike for Reutemann at any time in the season. When asked in an interview if he saw the Argentinian as a teammate or a rival, he replied, neither. Reutemann had claimed his first victory for Ferrari and the team's first of the season in the second race in Brazil, winning a battle with reigning world champion James Hunt and Mario Andretti. Once again, it was a victory of intelligent driving. Reutemann had been second fastest in qualifying and had pressured Hunt for several laps, forcing the Englishman to go harder than his front tyres could cope with. As Hunt began to struggle, Reutemann slipped past and cruised away to a comfortable victory. With Lauda departing for Brabham in 1978, Reutemann was partnered with Gilles Villeneuve in the Canadian's first full season in Formula 1. The two got along famously, striking a firm friendship. In an environment which suited Reutemann's personality, and with the Ferrari team once more unified following Lauda's departure, the Argentinian enjoyed perhaps his best season in Formula 1. even if the Ferrari was no match for the all-conquering Lotus 79. Reutemann claimed 4 victories in Brazil, Long Beach, Britain and at Watkins Glen. In Brazil, Reutemann dominated after starting from the second row of the grid, passing Hunt and Peterson before the first corner and then disappearing into a race of his own, 6 seconds ahead by the end of lap 2, ending the race with a comfortable 50-second cushion over the rest of the field. At Long Beach, Reutemann took victory despite a late spin caused by a lack of concentration resulting from having an enormous lead, and at that point he led the World Championship, but Lotus introduced a new 79 in Belgium, and it won 6 of the next 8 races, ending the championship for anyone not driving a black and gold JPS-sponsored car. The third victory of the season came at Brands Hatch, and was probably the one Reutemann savoured the most, coming as it did at the expense of Niki Lauda. Initially, the 2 Lotuses were in a class of their own, but after both failed before half distance, the race became a battle between Jody Scheckter, Lauda, Riccardo Patrese, Reutemann, John Watson and Patrick Depailler, all of whom were running nose to tail in the battle for the lead. Scheckter dropped out with gearbox failure, Patrese suffered a puncture, and Lauda used the opportunity to open a gap to the cars behind. The race was now between Lauda and Watson in the Brabham Alfa Romeos, split by Reutemann's Ferrari. Within 10 laps, Reutemann had closed the gap to Lauda and was sat on the gearbox of the Brabham. On lap 60, the two came up to lap Bruno Giacomelli. Lauda went to pass the McLaren on the right. Reutemann swooped to the left and passed both of them to claim the lead, reeling off the final laps to a victory, which was well received by the British crowd. At Watkins Glen, Reutemann claimed his final win of the season and third place in the championship by seeing off the challenge of Andretti's Lotus early in the race and then running untroubled to the finish as his closest challengers gradually dropped out of the race. It had been Reutemann's best season to date, and he was arguably the best driver in the field that year, the performance of the Lotus making things rather too easy for Andretti and Peterson. Something demonstrated when Jean-Pierre Jarier replaced Peterson after the latter's fatal accident at Monza. Jarier ran in third place at Watkins Glen until his car ran out of fuel, and at the season finale in Canada lost a certain win after the Cosworth engine in his Lotus 79 lost its oil. That being said, the prospect of Reutemann joining Andretti at Lotus for 1979 as a replacement for Peterson was one to savour, the world champion team and driver being joined by the man who had pushed them hardest throughout the season. Expectations were high for a landmark year for the Lotus team. Things were to turn out rather differently. To be frank, the new Lotus 80 was a dog. Far from being a step forward from the dominant 79, it proved complex, aerodynamically compromised, and woefully short on performance. Reutemann refused to drive it and reverted to the year-old Lotus 79 from the start of the season. Andretti gave up on the 80 after just 3 races. In terms of results, Reutemann had the edge on Andretti all season, picking up 4 podiums in the first half, including second places in his home race and in Spain. But when the team added reliability issues to the handicap of running a year-old car, the season fell to pieces. To add insult to injury, the Ferrari team Reutemann had left behind ran away with both the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship. Reutemann had walked away from a title-winning car. Unsurprisingly, Reutemann fell out with Lotus boss Colin Chapman, who was not noted for his easygoing nature or interest in compromise, and by the end of the season, the two parted company, with Reutemann moving to Williams as official number 2 driver to Alan Jones. Williams had emerged as the strongest team over the course of 1979, but because it took so long for it to work out the wrinkles in its car, Ferrari and its drivers had built an unassailable championship lead, so that despite Alan Jones and Clay Regazzoni claiming victory in 5 of the last 7 races of the season, the Italian team was far beyond reach. Williams were using a revised version of the FW07 in 1980 and were expected to be championship challengers. In Reutemann, the team had signed a strong backup for Jones. The season started with 2 races in South America, of which Reutemann would finish neither, and would then finish a delayed 5th in South Africa after a puncture. After this rocky start, he scored points in all of the remaining races, finishing on the podium 8 times and claiming his first win for Williams in Monaco. For the most part, though, the season was one spent playing the dutiful number 2, backing up Alan Jones in his battle for the title with Nelson Piquet, which was duly won with Williams' 1-2 finishes in the final 2 races in Canada and at Watkins Glen. Reutemann finished 3rd in the championship for the 3rd time. 1981 started well for Reutemann, finishing on the podium in each of the first 5 races, claiming 2 victories and comfortably leading the championship at this point in the season. Things in the Williams team were far from comfortable though. Reutemann was still contractually number 2 driver for the team, but after Jones had led home a Williams 1-2 in the opening race at Long Beach, there was controversy to come in the second race in Brazil. Reutemann had been involved in a qualifying long duel with local hero Nelson Piquet for pole position, which the Brazilian had just edged, but Reutemann was almost a full second ahead of Jones, who qualified in third place. Come race day, wet weather hung over the circuit, and despite the track being wet and little prospect of the sun coming out to dry things up, the Brabham team made a tactical mistake by starting Piquet on slicks. Right from the start, the Brazilian dropped down the order, whilst Reutemann and Jones pulled away from the field. The gap between the two Williams cars hovered around 7 seconds, with Reutemann in front. 4 laps from the flag, the Williams team held out a pit signal instructing Reutemann to allow Jones to pass, one which he ignored, and Reutemann took the checkered flag to claim his 3rd Grand Prix victory in Brazil. Here is where the story gets interesting. The race had been scheduled to run for 63 laps, but because of the slow pace resulting from the wet track, the checkered flag was shown on lap 62 instead, because of the rule which limits a Grand Prix to a 2-hour duration. Immediately after the race, Reutemann told the Williams team he had been intending to allow Jones past on the last lap, but was thwarted by the early finish. Interviewed later, Reutemann said that there was an internal struggle going on inside the car. He knew what his contract said, but he also knew that Formula One can only be about winning, a win which he had earned and was now being asked to give away. If I do that, then I stop the car now and leave immediately for my farm in Argentina, he said. If that final lap had been run, would he have given up that place? Only Reutemann ever knew, and perhaps not even him. Whilst outwardly Jones was calm after the events of Brazil, claiming he just saw Reutemann as another of his rivals now, in private the Australian was fuming and the atmosphere in the Williams motorhome and garages was toxic. Jones had lost all respect for his teammate and considered him to be both dishonourable and a cheat. However, a series of bad results for Jones meant that Reutemann was now the team's best shot for the title. Begrudgingly, they turned their focus to the Argentinian. After the British Grand Prix, Reutemann held a 17-point lead over Piquet, almost 2 victories worth of points. Yet he showed no signs of being confident in the title race, perhaps because of the atmosphere in the Williams team, perhaps because there was a feeling that the team weren't completely invested in their driver claiming the title. Over the 5 races that followed, Piquet cut the gap to nothing, scoring in every race, whilst retirements and a disaster of a wet weather race in Canada, where the Williams was so bad that Jones retired the car because of its awful handling, meant that Reutemann barely added to his tally. Arriving at the last race in Las Vegas, Reutemann held a slender 1-point lead over Piquet. Las Vegas was a race which promised to favour Reutemann, whilst the Argentinian was fit and strong. Nelson Piquet was notoriously unfit and struggled in races requiring physical effort. Unlike almost every circuit on the calendar, the Caesars Palace track ran anti-clockwise, meaning different muscles would be strained during the race. The addition of the Nevada heat was likely to further sap Piquet's performance. In qualifying, Reutemann was at his electrifying best, comfortably clear of teammate Jones to claim pole position. With the always racy Gilles Villeneuve out-qualifying Piquet for 3rd place, things were looking very good for Reutemann. Within half a lap of the start though, Reutemann's chances were effectively done. Problems selecting 4th gear meant that he had dropped to 5th by the end of the first lap, and was now driving without it, a serious handicap on the twisty Las Vegas circuit. On lap 17, Piquet caught Reutemann, who now had handling problems to cope with as well. Reutemann slowed, leaving the door open for his title rival to pass. The Brazilian now needed to just reach 6th place to claim the title. Piquet was to finish 5th, whilst Reutemann slipped down the field to finish 10th, losing the championship by 1 point. Right up until Piquet crossed the finishing line, the outcome of the championship was still in doubt, as Piquet was physically finished several laps before the flag, unable to hold his head up and losing time everywhere. Nobody would have been surprised if he had crashed out as a result of exhaustion during those final laps. As it was, it took 15 minutes before he could even stand after the end of the race. Afterwards, Reutemann was asked why he hadn't driven Piquet into the wall when he was being passed. It would have looked like a racing accident and nobody would have known. I would have known, replied Reutemann. And I wouldn't have felt like a world champion if I had. An honest and worthy response. In fact, many question why Reutemann had made it so easy for Piquet to pass. I suspect that he didn't want to get into a collision, which could have been perceived as foul play from the outside. Reutemann slipped away from Las Vegas and returned to Argentina, done with Formula One and fully intending to retire. As well as the disappointment of losing the championship, the conflict with Jones and the Williams team, Reutemann had been involved in a tragic accident at the Belgian Grand Prix at Zolder earlier in the season. The pit lane at Zolder had long been heavily criticised by drivers and teams for its lack of width, and prior to the 1981 race, the circuit owners and race organisers announced that the construction of a completely new pit complex would be undertaken prior to the 1982 race. It was to come 1 year too late. In Friday afternoon's qualifying session, As Reutemann was leaving the pit lane and heading out onto the track, an Ocello mechanic, Giovanni Amadeo, stepped back from the pit wall right into the path of Reutemann's rear wheel. He was picked up and thrown into the air, landing on his head and suffering multiple skull fractures, from which he died 3 days later. Reutemann was distraught following the accident, but somehow managed to pack away his feelings and perform a clean sweep of pole position, fastest lap and race win. After the race weekend was over though, Reutemann travelled to Italy and met 21-year-old Amadeo's parents, undoubtedly racked with guilt, even though there was absolutely nothing he could have done to avoid the accident, nor any blame attached to him. Reutemann's decision to retire would become a major problem for Williams, after Alan Jones announced his own retirement after winning in Las Vegas. Faced with the prospect of losing both his drivers, Frank Williams spent the season break persuading Reutemann to return for another season. He agreed to do so and finished second in the opening race in South Africa, looking as fast as ever and a potential title challenger. However, events were to take a different direction before the Brazilian Grand Prix, when Argentinian Marines invaded and raised their flag on the island of South Georgia, ramping up tensions between the UK and Argentina over ownership of the Falkland Islands. Reutemann found himself an Argentinian driver for a fiercely patriotic, some would say jingoistic, British team. Although he drove in the Brazilian Grand Prix, it is clear that his decision had already been made, and shortly after the race he announced his retirement from Formula One for good, the prospective Falklands War adding further weight to the reasons which drove his original decision to retire. His erstwhile teammate Keke Rosberg went on to claim the title that year. For the second time in his career, Reutemann had walked away from a championship-winning car. After his retirement, Reutemann took part in the 1985 WRC Argentinian Rally, driving a Group B Peugeot 205 T16 rally car. These Group B cars were monsters, accelerating as fast as a Formula One car, but doing so on mud, gravel or ice, through forests and on mountain roads. In 1986, after the death of Henri Toivonen, the Ayrton Senna of the rally world, they were banned for being too fast and too dangerous. But in the meantime, Reutemann tamed the beast sufficiently to claim third place, repeating a result he had previously achieved in 1980 driving a Fiat 131. Reutemann turned to politics and served as governor for Santa Fe for 2 terms between 1991 and 2003, being elected to the Argentinian Senate thereafter, although he declined to run for president on at least one occasion. Reutemann had one more Formula One story to write though. In 1995, 13 years after his retirement, Ferrari invited him to drive their car for a few demonstration laps at the end of the first practice session for that year's Argentinian Grand Prix. The practice session was very wet, and once the drivers had returned to their garages, Reutemann was allowed to exit the pits. What was supposed to be a 3-lap demonstration run turned out to be rather longer, as Reutemann accidentally didn't see the pit boards telling him to come in. After running more than a dozen laps in which he got faster and faster, Reutemann finished with a lap time which would have put him 11th in the session which had just finished, at the age of 53. In a car he had never driven before, in the wet, and 11 years since he had last driven any sort of Grand Prix car. It was a remarkable achievement. For all that he never won the World Championship, Reutemann was widely acknowledged as perhaps the fastest driver of his era, on his day. The problem being that those days weren't as frequent as they should have been. In fact, there were days when he just didn't seem to be on his game at all. There is one Argentinian driver who is remembered as the greatest of his era, and maybe of all time. Reutemann was perhaps good enough to write a similar story. It just seemed like he never actually wanted it enough. In the end, he was a dolphin in a sea of sharks.